Craig Stanley has spent over 30 years building revenue engines inside companies like PwC, Aero Electronics, and high growth firms scaling across the whole country. Today, he helps businesses grow lean by optimizing their revenue function. This means you don't have to default to hiring sprees that kill your margin. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. Really excited about spending some time with you.
So you've led some pretty large revenue teams north of 300 million at PwC. You've built teams from the ground up. When you think about growing an org, scaling a team, are there any lessons from those larger teams that still apply to early stage or smaller companies?
So I would say a couple of things. Larger companies generally have their strategies in place, right? They know who their target customers are. They know what kind of markets they're going after. They have a lot of generally predictable cash flow where they can invest in acquiring new businesses or launching into new geographies or acquiring new customers, whatever that looks like. Smaller businesses have none of those resources generally. So it really becomes about taking the lessons learned in big companies. What does high performance look like? What does intentionality look like? What does strategy look like? What does HR alignment look like? What does change management look like? And then applying some of those concepts to organizations that tend to be much more resource constrained.
When you're working with a leader and they say, we need to grow, what do you think they actually mean?
Well, I think everybody goes into a business with the aspiration to grow, whatever that means to them. Unfortunately, typically, a lot of business owners are conditioned to think growth just means incremental top line revenue. And when I talk to a lot of business owners and business leaders, their view is my goal is to grow by 5% or 8% or 10%. Pick your number, but that's the goal. Unfortunately, I think that's misaligned and maybe misguided for a lot of business owners. What people really ought to be thinking about is, how do I build a business that ultimately is growing in its value, not just top line revenue? They mistakenly think that those two correlate, and they often don't. If you're taking on top line revenue with no strategy behind it, and the top line revenue, if you're doing a land grab for top line revenue, sometimes it's not profitable, it's not strategically aligned, it's with the wrong types of customers, it's distracting from your core mission. So they look at it though through the lens of, I just want to acquire more cash and more cash flow, as opposed to, I want to build value in the organization and build transferability in the organization, which becomes a big key as well. Growth, in my opinion, ought to be looked at through a different lens than most business owners do, through the lens of every decision I make, whether it's a person I take on, or a customer I target, products that I launch, ought to be done through the lens of, does this create value and does it create transferability?
What's the difference between an income-based org and a value-based org?
Yeah, we've done, and one of the first things we do when we go into organizations is we do a financial analysis, and we look at effectively a P&L of some subset of the top customers and some set of the bottom customers, as well as products and services, as well as people on their sales team. And I think it's important to look at, when it's income-based, and you're doing a top line land grab for revenue, you're just looking at everything as incremental revenue, as opposed to those things becoming an opportunity cost for the organization and ultimately potentially dilutive of value. A lot of times we look at, I'll have a manufacturing organization, for example, that will say, I do $30 million in revenue. I've got an $8 million customer that I absolutely can't lose. And when we go through the P&L process, we find out that they've allowed themselves to be negotiated down on price because the customer knows they're their biggest customer and they have a lot of leverage in the organization. They've got a fully dedicated, assigned $250,000 a year salesperson. They've got 2 customer support people. They've allowed themselves to be strung out on terms, so they're screwing up their cash flow. And ultimately, once you dig into the P&L and start allocating some costs, that customer on every transaction is losing the organization money and therefore destroying value within the organization. And so becoming, and not to imply that they ought to immediately fire the customer, but the model clearly isn't working. The vast majority of people, and we in the business community, are not working in not-for-profit organizations. We need to focus on what builds net profitability, organizational value, and again, transferability. And those types of situations, and or those situations where, for example, we've got salespeople that are being attributed a lot of revenue that they didn't actually create. It's not incremental. They're making a lot of money on existing customers. those things aren't incremental to the value creation of the organization. So how do we activate, for example, the sales organization to do what, in my opinion, sales organizations ought to solely do, which is creating that which could not be created if they weren't in their spots. And so how do we incentivize that incremental value creation as opposed to just revenue attribution that they're given just because they're assigned a randomly drawn set of geographic boundaries or assigned customers that have been customers for the long term and likely would continue to order through us whether that salesperson was in their seat or not.
This is a little bit off topic, but you opened this can of worms. Should a salesperson, because I know the Mike Weinberg hunters versus zookeepers, should your salespeople be taking care of your current customers, or should you have salespeople and then somebody else who takes care of your current customers, in your opinion?
It's an interesting question and one that I get asked in every single engagement that I do. And so if you look at, and we'll get into probably the revenue function operating system here in a bit, but if you look at the revenue function operating system, and you start with the financial model, the financial model should lead us into three fairly independent but interconnected strategies. One is once we've identified customers that are needle moving in terms of value for the organization and that we absolutely must keep at all cost based on the current model, what does the organizational structure, what are the expectations of the people, what does the compensation look like to maintain those customers? Where within our customer portfolio do we have opportunities for growth, and how do we create an environment that allows us to extract growth opportunities where we've got a match between our capabilities and the needs of our customers? How do we most effectively extract that based on the organizational structure, expectations, and reinforcing compensation? And then how do we go to market and cultivate and ultimately convert great opportunities for new customers that ultimately become the lifeblood of the organization and substantially increase value of the organization? What does that organizational structure look like? And so those three structures and strategies ultimately could mean that the same person is doing each. It could mean that you've got a different organizational structure, and we try to align things around the concept of scalability, efficiency, and effectiveness. And so does this platform allow us to scale? Does it allow us to scale in a way that is both efficient and effective? Sometimes that requires salespeople to concentrate on existing customers, not only for maintenance, but also to extract growth opportunities. Sometimes we want to move that to a customer support function and have the salespeople focus on creating that which is incremental. When we get into, and I know this is a long answer to your fairly short question, but when we get into that maintenance category, how do we hold on to our existing high value customers? I think it's fair for an organization to say, not only are you responsible for these, we have a structure and an expectation. You must actually do something to be paid on those customers that you're maintaining. That's not as hard as acquiring new customers. You sit on top of orders that are already happening, but there is some level of sales effort that needs to be exerted. We're going to allow you to do that, but we're also going to establish what we term a minimum standard of care. Your salespeople must do certain things to maintain eligibility for compensation. Because we know those things are considered best practices, we want to create consistency across our organization and how we treat customers. And we think this gives us the best possible opportunity to maintain those customers. Long answer to your short question, but hopefully that gave you what you needed.
I worked with one company that couldn't make payroll, but the salespeople, I'm air quoting, were doing great, and the marketing team was, quote, doing great. They're spending $8,000 a month on leads, on ads to bring in 6,000 sales. This was a very small ticket item, like $100 a month item. And the salespeople were making $200K because they kept getting paid for years on the accounts that were already in there. I was like, this is glaringly obvious. There's something wrong. It's not, quote, doing well. Comp is a really fun topic. And I know you're an
Well,
expert
and when
at
you
it.
aggregate, and when you aggregate that across an organization, so you have a $10 million organization that has 10 salespeople, if they make on average a fully loaded compensation of $200,000 each per year, that's $2 million of investment by a $10 million organization. That is probably the largest investment they'll make. And if that piece of the business is suboptimized and isn't creating a positive ROI, they've got a massive scalability issue.
Mm-hmm. They sure did. They didn't like my answer to that, but it was interesting. You opened the door a little bit to this. So, what are these 4 key pillars of an optimized revenue function?
Yeah, so I mentioned the first, which is understand the financial model. And when we go in to a client project, we start with effectively some organizations on the smaller side of things may not have the complete financial wherewithal, some do, but it's at least a back of the napkin P&L, some subset of customers, the products and services that they sell. A lot of times that becomes very revealing as well, where they may have been asked by a good customer at one point to launch a particular service that might be ancillary to what they're already doing. It's commoditized, there's not a broader market for it, and they're losing money on that product or service that they've decided to take on. And again, it becomes distracting to their ability to focus on that which creates more versus that which creates less. We'll also, to your point earlier about the salesperson, ask them to do a P&L on each individual sales team member. So when we do a P&L on the sales team member, it may or may not be their fault, but organizationally, we may have put people in a position where when we compare their fully loaded compensation against their net profit incremental contribution to the organization, they're an asset that is producing a negative ROI versus a positive ROI. May just be our fault as a business owner that we need to do some realignment and reset expectations and reset compensation, but at least we know where we are from a financial modeling perspective. The second piece is letting your financial model then determine those three strategies that we just discussed around maintaining, growing, and ultimately cultivating and converting new customers, identifying who your market is, who your ideal customers are, and what your market messaging is. The third piece is on the alignment of resources. Do we need salespeople? What are we asking them to do? How are we measuring them? How are we coaching and holding them accountable? How are we reinforcing what they're doing with compensation? And the fourth pillar is really defining and executing against high performance and a high performance model, creating consistency across the organization to say when we have a person in a BDR role or a customer support role or a sales role, we have the same operating model and expectations for each. We have relatively similar compensation structures for each that ultimately give us the execution against what we know we need from a best practice and strategy execution perspective, and also allows us to scale in a way that as we add people, we've got consistency in execution across the organization. And we've got the ability to identify and remediate and or replace when needed those that either are unwilling or incapable of meeting that high expectation or that expectation for high performance rather.
How should leaders think about revenue as an org as a system rather than just a set of departments?
Yeah, and I think that speaks to sort of the earlier part of our conversation around most think of revenue as anybody that can fog a mirror and has a checkbook is a legitimate target. And I'm going after any and all of these, which the analogy that I tend to make is a hunting analogy for anybody who's been hunting, which is you don't generally go in the woods and take a shotgun and just shoot it through the trees and hope something falls out. You become very intentional about that which has the ability to feed your family. You know that if what I'm hunting is a deer, for example, and I tend not to be a deer hunter, but for those who are, you know you've got to be in a certain type of field at a certain time of day with a certain type of weapon and certain type of ammunition and a certain type of camouflage on with a certain type of scent. All of those you do very intentionally when you're in that environment. Sales hunting should be looked at no differently. And again, starting with that financial model and then getting very concentrated and intentional about the supporting infrastructure needed to create the right kind of growth with the right types of customers at the right type of profitability. That really becomes revenue generation through the lens of value creation as opposed to revenue for revenue's sake.
Have you ever seen the TV show Alone?
I know of the show. I have not actually seen an episode.
It's magnificent. They go in the forest, they drop them off. There's no one near, so they hunt. They can bring bows and arrows. And all I thought was when you spray the shotgun, I was thinking they have to hit grouse every season. They're hunting grouse, and that's all there is for a lot of these people. But I had never even heard of a grouse before. They'll shoot the arrows up in the tree and try to get them.
Yeah, exactly. Tends not to be a great strategy.
How many times when you're working with a team are they thinking, oh, this is our ICP and this is like these are bread and butter customers. But then when you look at the data and the financials, you're actually looking at what's working. It's not the same.
Yeah. I would say probably more times than not. And I would say more times than not, as an addition to that, the ICP is generated from sales rep to sales rep and not necessarily organizationally, and then aligned across the sales and marketing organizations, which is another component that we focus on. A lot of organizations do the shoot the shotgun through the tree or fire your arrow into the tree analogy, and it becomes this shotgun. I actually just talked to a client the other day, and from a marketing perspective, they were getting tons of leads, but the average customer revenue as a result of those leads was only about $3,800. And they really wanted customers that were generating over $50,000 in revenue. And so clearly what marketing was attracting was not in alignment with ideal customer profiles from an either new customer acquisition perspective or the creation of opportunities for growth within those customers. And so that created a bit of an alignment opportunity within that particular organization, because even in the marketing organization, that wasn't necessarily aligned to the individual sales reps who all had a different perspective on the ideal customer. And even their actions weren't aligned with the capturing and conversion of ideal customers. They were doing the, sort of whack-a-mole for revenue thing.
If somebody's missing one of those 4 pillars that you mentioned, or they're just misaligned across the revenue org, what impact can that have on trying to scale up?
Again, it's important to recognize all 4 of those aspects. If you don't have the financial model right and in place, you will in perpetuity be doing the land grab for top line revenue and ultimately decreasing your ability to create a valuable transferable asset. If you don't have the organization, if you don't have the strategy built, you don't have anything to align the organization against. And so you're making guesses and doing things on gut feel. If ultimately you haven't defined high performance, there's an interesting article on LinkedIn the other day about the cost of maintaining underperformers. If you don't have that structure built and the organizational alignment and expectations, how do you know when somebody's underperforming? And how do you know when they're underperforming because we as organizational leaders haven't built the right expectations around the right alignment to strategy, or they're just underperforming because of the market conditions or their misassignment to a territory that is not a territory that really ever will become profitable and fruitful for the rep. So all of those are, in my opinion, equally important, but the financial model ultimately has to serve as the guiding light for the organization. I think a lot of organizations focus on, and rightfully so, things like mission, vision, and values and organizational happiness and the happiness of the employees. Those things are all great, but we can't make investments in new people. We can't pay bonuses to people. We can't make investments in growing markets and ultimately creating an organization that becomes much more fulfilling for everyone unless we meet that financial obligation to continue to build a long-term viable asset.
Stressed 4 owners out there, but I know this is all great advice and they'll love it. If somebody's looking to grow, how do they know whether they need to change a process or add headcount?
The financial modeling will determine a lot of that. So when you look at the financial model, even on compensation, I think a lot of people neglect to look at compensation through the lens of it's got to be mutually beneficial. It's got to be fair and create great opportunity for the sales rep, but only when it creates a substantial amount of incremental organizational benefit. And so what does that look like financially, and how do we do the financial modeling around that to say, not just can't get a good sales rep for under $200,000 or pick the number depending on the industry and type of sales that are being done and what the specific role is. So I need to find a way to pay the rep $200,000. They can do that, but they've got to back into it via the financial model to say, if I'm paying the rep $200,000, they need to create $400,000 to $800,000 in incremental value for the organization. That's coming directly out of net profit, meaning they've got to create $5 to $8 million in net sales or in gross sales for the organization. And so does that model exist? Is it realistic and is it attainable? And are we creating the right infrastructure? And I'm talking about even starting with things like job descriptions, onboarding. How do we onboard people to increase speed to value? And then how do we hold them accountable, recognizing great performance when we see it, as well as underperformance when we see it, and doing those things that need to either reward or remediate depending on what we're seeing. So as a business owner, I think North Star is the financial model, and not just the financial model from a top line target perspective, but the financial model in terms of how that translates into net profitability.
If you're going into a company that's already in existence, they're 10 years old, how difficult is it to unpack these things and then do the change management needed to have the team all aligned?
Yeah. Well, You bring up a great topic, and that is where a lot of organizations fall down. They say, this is our new strategy or this is our new structure. Starting tomorrow, your job is going to be vastly different than it was today. And it's going to take you 6 months to ramp into this new job, and you're a commission-based employee. So don't expect any commissions for the next 6 months. And it tends to not achieve the outcome that the organization's looking to achieve. And it tends not to be a fair way to do things for those employees that may have been with the organization for 6 or 8 or 10 of those years. And so I've talked in other podcasts and in some of my thought leadership collateral around sort of the science or the math behind building the right structure or the right program or the right strategy, but also leveraging the right level of art and change management in doing the right thing that underscores the need to create change, but also does it in a way that gives people an opportunity to adapt to the change and do it in a way that from a compensation perspective is fair for them, but ultimately achieves the outcome the organization's looking for.
You coach sales and sales leaders. If you're coaching someone who inherits a team and they're being told to grow revenue, but you can't add any headcount, is there any advice you'd give to them of where to get started?
Yeah, again, I think having some operating model to operate against within sales and having a high degree of intentionality, a lot of organizations fall into the trap of taking their best salesperson, putting them in a job of a sales leader, and then expecting that person, because they were successful in an individual production role, they're going to be able to model the rest of the team around what they have historically done. That tends not to be a great answer because they do that without any mentorship, without any tools, without any training, without any modeling of behavior. They're just expected to figure it out. And there are not a lot of great ways to figure it out. I have found Mike Weinberg's Sales Management Simplified, as well as a book that he's written called New Manager/Sales, to be fairly effective guidelines in terms of how to put some structure in place. But I think you've got to have some sort of an operating model. And I also listened to a masterclass a couple of weeks ago around the concept of pseudo productivity. A lot of organizations, when they're looking to grow, it's just, we're going to grow with the same customers, the same strategy, the same sort of haphazard approach to the market. And we're just going to run faster on the hamster wheel this year than we did last year, which tends not to be optimal in terms of creating that scalability and efficiency that we talked about earlier. So not allowing yourself as a new manager in sales taking over a team to fall into the trap that activity equates to productivity, and ensuring that what we're asking people to do is creating an outcome, and we're creating the framework that allows them to be in a great spot to achieve that outcome if they've got the skills and the desire. And so it's, again, a couple of things to summarize all that. Number one, having some sort of an operating framework. And then number two, making sure that everything we're doing achieves the ultimate outcome of net profitability and organizational value creation, and not just creating activity for activity's sake.
Yeah, can you dive into that a little bit more? What's the difference between how many calls they make, how many meetings they have, and watching and managing activity versus leading a team towards outcomes?
Yeah, it's really around the effectiveness of the activity. So to use another maybe sports analogy, I look at the at-bats we have. We want to create more at-bats, but we certainly want to increase our batting average. And given the two, we want to increase our batting average more than we want to increase our at-bats, because that's where we create efficiency. And so a lot of organizations will even go so far as to I'm going to pay you based on the number of calls you make, or I'm going to pay you based on the number of meetings you have. I don't care necessarily whether a sales rep makes 40 calls, 400 calls, or 40,000 calls. If they all are ineffective, they don't have the right value proposition, they're not to the right people, it's not going to achieve the outcome I'm looking for. If we get really intentional organizationally, and we structure and be very specific about the assignments of our targets, what the attributes of those targets are, what our messaging is to those targets, how we uniquely solve business issues, and we structure all that correctly, we don't necessarily need to manage the 4,000 calls. We may have some level of expectation around activity, but we have a really good sense that that activity is going to lead to the outcomes we're looking for, not just, again, activity for activity's sake.
I had one CRO who gave me Weinberg's book, and he said, we're going to look at results of your reps first, then their pipeline, then their activity. And a lot of folks are looking at activity first, and they're not looking at what's going well or what's not going well. They're not looking at the results. What mindset shift has to happen for a company to move from this income-based org or a reactive shotgun everywhere org to strategic growth in the next few years?
Well, and it's interesting that you bring that up, and this may be perceived to be blasphemy kind of in the Weinberg world, but I'm working with a lot of clients now on a bit of an addendum to his RPA kind of model. So I like the RPA model, so I'll start with that. The RPA model, I think, does a couple of things. I like to be in organizations where you create the right environment for the sales reps, but then you're delegating the outcome. Your outcome is achievement of X number of dollars within this target set or within your existing clients at a profitability rate of X. And so you sort of laid out what the expectation for the outcome is. And then we treat people like adults, right? You want people to have a sense of ownership of their territory or their set of prospects. You want them to have a level of autonomy. You want them to be able to develop an annual strategic plan that says, I've been given these assets, and these assets could be your target, it could be your phone script, it could be your value propositions, it could be the supporting marketing material and investment we're making. Now you need to figure out with these assets how you maximize revenue and profitability within your territory, which ultimately, if aligned correctly, is going to maximize your personal income. And so that's why I like starting with okay, what are your results? How are you progressing toward your goal? Because ultimately, we all want the same thing if the compensation is structured correctly. Your maximization of your attainment of your goal results in greater organizational value. It also creates maximization of your personal income. So we're all pulling the rope in the same direction. So I like that. Let's start with your results. In terms of pipeline, there are not a lot of areas where sales leadership or organizational leadership have windshield type visibility to what's coming in the future. A lot look at previous financial results, and so they're always looking out of the rearview mirror. You need to understand from a financial planning, from an inventory planning, from a compensation perspective, where we're going to have potentially explosions in growth where we're going to need to increase capacity, or we're going to have shortfalls in growth where we may need to rethink our organizational structure and we may not be able to afford everybody we've got, and or we need to do some other things around pipeline creations. The pipeline piece, I think, is very important as well, and that is obviously the responsibility of the rep to create the pipeline that will ultimately lead to the results. The piece that I've added to this is the S piece, which is strategy. So it's not only what are your activities, it is what is your strategy. If you've got a shortfall, based on the assets that you've got, what is your strategy to be able to close that shortfall between now and the end of the year and ultimately make sure at the end of the year you get to the result you're looking for? Again, I think that reinforces the autonomy of the rep and that concept of being a franchisee of the organization. And then we get into, against that strategy, now what activities are we employing? And what's your frequency and what's your volume and who are you doing those activities with and how are they going to lead to the results? But I think it's really important to incorporate that strategy element, because without that, I think it assumes that the activities are going to lead to more pipeline, which leads to more revenue. And if you are ineffective at the activities, you're going to create not the results you're looking for.
Do you have any stories about how following this structure or just simply putting strategy in place in a sales org has helped the same size team just turn it up and not just be shooting shotgun? I'm not using the right terms here. Not just shooting their shotgun all over the forest.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I was working with a client, this has been probably a month ago or so, and one of the sales reps within the client said, I'm not even sure what I do when I wake up every day, but I start to check email and I get busy and I get customers asking me for stuff and I get people that may want to order things. And then I kind of figure it out throughout the course of the day. Operating with no strategy or with no intentionality tends not to yield great results. And I've had clients tell me that this, between the minimum standard of care and that we create for the reps with those expectations, having really highly defined expectations with goals, building that environment then allows them, again, the autonomy to build the strategy for their particular assignment within the world of the business that they're working for. And so whether that assignment is a geographic territory, a set of named accounts, whatever that looks like, they should be then given the autonomy, assuming we're hiring professionals with some level of experience that have the capability to do that, to then give to them an organizationally established format to say, okay, what is your strategy? What are you going after to attain your goals within these set of expectations? And then tactically, What are your expectations around what you're going to be doing to build pipeline and ultimately profitable revenue? And then what resources do you need from the organization to be able to achieve those kinds of things? And Mike Weinberg talks a lot about the concept within sales leadership of the management and accountability meetings and the management accountability framework. Part of that accountability framework then becomes you are the rep, you were given these assets, you developed your own annual plan. This is what you said you were going to do. You're not achieving your numbers. Are you doing these things? Do we need to revisit the strategy? What does that look like? But that becomes a really important tool in terms of helping the reps feel like they've got some level of autonomy, which they should. But with that autonomy comes responsibility to execute against what they said they were going to execute and produce the financial results that they've committed to and that we organizationally expect. So it's that type of framework eliminates those situations, which I think a lot of organizations have, where you have a rep that says, I don't even know what I'm going to do when I get up. I know I've got these things in my pipeline that seem to be relatively imminent, and I'm going to focus on getting those closed. I'm not sure what the rest of my pipeline looks like or what I need to be thinking about 8 months from now based on an opportunity I have today to give me the best opportunity for closure, or how I need to execute against my overarching strategy, but making sure that it doesn't become this haphazard, again, sort of whack-a-mole environment in terms of I got the opportunity for the day, I'm going to crush that one and move on to the next one without a lot of strategy behind those activities that are happening.
I interviewed folks and they said their favorite thing about sales was every day was different. I'd be like, is it? Or you probably shouldn't be. It should be
Yeah,
boring at some points because you're doing the same thing. Well, I feel like we could have 7 conversations and just go down a rabbit hole of comp, go down a rabbit hole of the 4 pillars. I appreciate you so much for coming on. You have a podcast. Where can people find that?
I actually do a lot of this. I don't have my own podcast, but
You
I've participated on a couple
so
of
many.
with Mike Weinberg and business advisors and different types of podcasts. So I try to create a decent amount of content. I do actually have a white paper that I've written, and we talk about scaling without necessarily incremental people investment. I think it hits on exactly that point. It's called You Don't Need More Horses, You Need a Tractor. And so it really was as a result of a conversation that I was having with somebody in private equity who said, we've got a company that is doing $20 million with 4 sales reps. All we need to do is add 4 more sales reps and we'll do $40 million in revenue. And I said, time out. Doesn't exactly work that way. And I actually based it on a paper my son had to write in high school. It was a 10-page paper on a technological advancement that has changed sort of the course of history. Well, his grandfather in southern Indiana farmed a family farm during the time initially when they used horses for farming. There's only so much you can do with scaling the number of horses you have based on feeding and resting and illness and all the things that have to go into farming with horses. That doesn't create an operating system that moves the needle. If you incorporate a revenue function operating system, that has the ability to serve as your tractor within the organization as opposed to thinking you just need to add more horses. So in terms of my developed content, I've got that and a number of other pieces available on my website, but I've done a number of podcasts. I just don't have my own.
You're just the guest everybody wants to have, and we got to have you. So thank you.
Well,
I'll link to that in the below. And what's one book, show, or podcast that you're loving lately?
yeah, so it's probably a series more of podcasts than a podcast. But if you're familiar with Masterclass, I'm a big fan of Masterclass. They've got people on like Wolfgang Puck that'll teach you how to cook a beef bourguignon. They've got J-Lo's choreographer that'll teach you how to hip hop dance. That may not necessarily at this point be my thing, but the eclectic nature of all the people they have on and the types of content that maybe get your brain thinking in a different way. They have presidential historians. They have people talking on leadership topics. Michael Eisner at Disney did one. Bill Clinton and George Bush have done one. They've got a guy named Daniel Pink, who is sort of a known authority within this marketing and sales space that's done one. They've got this guy that I mentioned earlier that did one. He's a Harvard professor that is a productivity expert and talks about the concept of pseudo productivity. So that one I really try to immerse in, and that's where I spend a lot of my time on treadmills and elliptical machines and maybe absorb some content that helps me help my clients think differently, and hopefully run better businesses and be a little more aware of what's going on in the world around us.
I do love Masterclass. There's always something. You want to learn how to make tortillas? Good. Here you go. Or how
Yeah,
to run a business.
yeah. Play a guitar. Here's Carlos Santana.
And then what's one thing that you're learning or looking to sharpen this year?
Yeah, well, AI tends to be the topic of the day. And I would say, both for the benefit of my own business, how to create greater efficiency in how I run my own business and the types of things that I leverage AI for, as well as how to guide my clients to leverage AI in the right way. I think a lot of people haven't really defined an AI strategy. They don't know how to use it. They're trying to do this one-off stuff without necessarily a lot of intentionality behind the use of AI. But learning more about that particular topic and how to deploy it, like I said, for both professional and personal life, as well as the improvement of my clients and how they run their businesses, is the topic of the year for me.
Yeah, this is the most non-AI conversation I've had in a while. It was like a breath of fresh air. We were just talking about the human side of it. I love it. I appreciate you so much for coming on. Thank you again, Greg.
Yeah, Chelsea, really enjoyed the time, and thanks for inviting me to the podcast. And hopefully we've given some of your listeners some tips that they'll find to be helpful.
For sure. We'll talk to you again soon.